Good morning, everyone. Your Excellency Dr. Abdullah bin Ali Al-Thani, Your Excellency Lola Al-Khater, Dean Dallal, and esteemed colleagues and guests. My name is Suhair Siddiqui. For those of you who haven't met me, and I haven't had the pleasure of meeting you, I'm a professor of Islamic studies here and this year's conference chair. I'd like to wish you all a warm welcome to Doha and Georgetown, Qatar. This year's conference committee consists of Amira Sonbol, Gabor Agustin, and Dr. Uday Chandra, who couldn't be here. And when we were formulating the idea of this year's annual conference, we wanted to think of something that was both relevant to the interests of the students, both reflected our own intellectual interests, and also we thought would engage with the broader community and broader academic interests here in Qatar. And that led us to decide to create a conference on Islamic intellectual thought. After that, then it was a matter of narrowing it down. You have 1,400 years of history to try to narrow things down into. And we chose the 16th to 18th centuries because we felt that they were typically understudied in Islamic studies, yet incredibly rich and diverse politically, socially, intellectually, and culturally. And we set out a broad call for papers, and we're really elated to receive a lot of really interesting papers that touched on a variety of various interests in Islamic intellectual thought. And so I thank you all for submitting your papers and for making the journeys here. And I think over the next 2 days, we'll have an interesting set of conversations around issues of law, politics, community, literary traditions, textual traditions that I think will be quite fascinating for everybody in the room. Before turning it over to Dr. Ahmad Dallal, who's going to make some introductions to the conference, I just want to do a few thank yous, which I think are very important. First and foremost to Hega Raka, who's in the back, who's kind of been our silent stallion for the last 6 months, helping organize the conference. Sara in the back and Reina, who have been helping with logistics for the past few months, and Sally, who I can't see, but if everyone can join me in giving them a big round of applause and a thank you. To formally welcome you guys to Georgetown and to kick off the conference, I can't think of anyone better than Ahmad Dallal, who I'm sure all of you are familiar with. His recent book, Islam Without Europe, actually focuses on the 18th century and really encapsulates kind of this new scholarship that's taking place to refocus Islamic intellectual thought on the post-classical period and look at the diverse and discursive Islamic intellectual traditions. Ahmad, the floor is yours.
Your Excellency, Dr. Abdullah bin Ali Al-Thani, Your Excellency Lola Al-Khater, esteemed colleagues, welcome to Georgetown University in Qatar and to the opening of this two-day annual research conference, Transformations and Continuities in Islamic Intellectual Thought. It is my honor to open today's event, which presents some of the impactful research being conducted by our faculty members and their peers around the world on an important period of the history of the Muslim world. Multiple faculty-driven initiatives, often organized in collaboration with local, regional, and international partners, serve to strengthen the mission and impact of scholarship by creating knowledge-sharing platforms, providing valuable resource databases, and serving as teaching tools in the classroom to enrich the curriculum and guide students to transform critical thinking into working practice. Knowledge-sharing platforms such as our annual faculty conference allow scholars from around the world to also benefit from our location in Qatar. So welcome and thank you for joining us, for making the journey, joining us today at this in a year of celebration. This year we are pleased to join the School of Foreign Service in celebrating their 100-year anniversary. And I'm proud to share with you that we are also celebrating a research year milestone, the publication of 100 books authored or edited by Georgetown University faculty and staff. During the past year, the university has been taking stock of the research activities developed by our faculty and their international colleagues. And one of the consistent emerging themes has been the importance of promoting a collaborative spirit with a broad network of colleagues and institutions. The subject of today's conference is one that can only be assessed through such collaborative and cumulative scholarship of groups of researchers. Despite great differences over details, we all operate in the shadow of the paradigm of decline, which presumably started sometime between the 13th and 15th century, and for some even the 11th, but definitively culminated in the 18th. This paradigm is pervasive in scholarship on the history and especially culture of the Muslim world. In the last 3 decades, many historians have questioned, with varying degrees of success, the adequacy of this paradigm and its heuristic value. But we are still far from a consensus over the characterization of the long hazy period between the classical period and the end of the 18th century. Some historians have convincingly criticized notions of a comprehensive social and economic decline in this period. But they often invite scholars to shift the focus of research from the sphere of culture to that of political economy. So, for example, Roger Owen argues in his much-quoted critique of Gibbon Bowen's Islamic society in the 18th century, which is probably the most influential summation of the Orientalist thesis of decline in the 18th century. Owen argues that the notion of decline is a result of the focus on culture, and that a shift to the paradigm of political economy would lead to different conclusions. And there are several other attempts in the same vein. This invitation to shift the focus of research implies that though there is cultural stagnation in the 18th century, we are likely to reach different conclusions if we focus our attention on political economy. While this is meant as a critique of traditional approaches to post-classical Islamic history, it in effect concedes the long-standing assumption of cultural stagnation in this period. In an insightful essay, Reinhard Schulze argues that the traditional Orientalist approach has rendered the intellectual legacy of the 18th century unreadable. But as critics of Schulze have noted, in addition to the flaws in the specific evidence adduced by Schulze to assert the vitality of the 18th century, for example, the notion of Neo-Sufism, Schulze and the revisionist school which he invokes, which includes Ibrahim Abul-Lughod initially, Peter Gran, and above all, John Voll. Also, this group failed to, as the critics of Schulze have noted, failed to identify the elements of 18th century innovation. Take, for example, the emphasis in this particular school on the study of hadith in the 17th and 18th centuries. Voll, following Fazlur Rahman, have emphasized the so-called socio-moral use of hadith. That is, on hadith as the source providing standards of individual and collective codes of conduct. So in his much quoted Revival and Reform in Islam, Fazlur Rahman, you probably, everyone who studies early modern Islamic history knows this particular article. It was the primary reference until it was replaced by my article, so a couple of years ago. It was the primary reference for several decades, actually. Fazlur Rahman argues that as a result of the belief that the Sunnah of the Prophet and the Quranic rulings on social behavior have to be more or less literally implemented in all ages, the ideas of 18th century thinkers did not contribute to the, and I quote here, rethinking of the social content of Islam, or to its reformulation. In the same vein, in another influential classic by John Voll, Islamic Continuity and Change in the Modern World, Voll speaks of a, and I quote, widespread spirit of socio-moral reconstruction based on a more strict adherence to the Quran and the Sunnah of the Prophet. And then Voll connects the intensive interest in hadith scholarship in Cairo and Medina and other places to the desire among the reformers of the 18th century to, and I quote, bridge the gap between the ideal community that was described by the traditions, unquote, and the actual practices in contemporary Muslim societies. This emphasis has shifted the focus of examination from the intellectual content of 18th century writings on hadith to the social uses of this discipline, even though it sets out to revise Orientalist assertions. This view, in fact, conforms with the traditional Orientalist notions of intellectual stagnation. Sharing the underlying assumption that 18th century movements are more interesting than 18th century thought, both views presuppose that the 18th century, and by extension the 17th and the 16th, did not contribute much of value to at the intellectual level. As such, what's implied in the notion of indigenous revival is indigenous but intellectually impoverished revival. Needless to say, what is impoverished is our ability to utilize this vast body of literature, which is one of the most important legacies of Islamic culture. After these two waves of revisionist historiography, a third wave is gradually gaining momentum. Increasingly, scholars are focusing on the intellectual vitality of the post-classical period, specifically the 16th to 18th centuries. A vitality that is comparable to, and in some instances even supersedes in its scope, intensity, and quality, the cultural activities of the so-called classical period. Examples of this wave include work on logic in the 17th century, the intersection of Sufism and Hadith in 16th century India, 16th century Indian intellectual reform, and tracing regional genealogies as opposed to trans-regional networks. To my mind, today's conference has the distinct advantage of providing a comparative approach that questions the notion of decline not only by examining it in different periods and contexts, but also by doing so through the prism of several intellectual and cultural traditions. The entrenched and powerful paradigm of decline can only be dislodged through such systematic and collaborative rethinking as assembled in this gathering. So thank you all for your engaged participation. I look forward to learning from your perspectives, and I hope that today only marks the beginning of many more things to come. But before I conclude, I would like to thank the conference organizers, Dr. Suhaira Siddiqui, and the conference committee, Dr. Amira Sumbul, Gabor Agostin, Uday Chandra, for all the work they did in conceptualizing this conference, and of course, Hagar Racha, who, as Suhaira noted, did all the work to make this conference possible. Now, it gives me great pleasure to introduce our keynote speaker, Dr. Judith Pfeiffer. Dr. Pfeiffer received her PhD in Near Eastern Languages and Civilizations from the University of Chicago in 2003. And she taught Islamic history at the University of Oxford from 2003 to 2016, before joining the University of Bonn to take up an Alexander von Humboldt professorship there. Her research focuses on Islamic intellectual history during the latter middle and early modern periods, conversion and confessionalization processes, and the interaction between the local and Mongol elites in the Ilkhanate. She has published on religion and politics in the Mongol and Ottoman context, and is editor or co-editor of History and Historiography of Post-Mongol Central Asia and the Middle East, Studies in Honor of John E. Woods, Theoretical Approaches to the Transmission and Edition of Orientalist Manuscripts, Politics, Patronage, and the Transmission of Knowledge in 13th to 15th century Tabriz, and Rashid al-Din's Bayan al-Haqa'iq and its Sitz im Leben in 2016. She is currently preparing a publication for publication, the inventory of the early 16th century private library of the Ottoman scholar and bibliophile Mu'ayyid Zadeh. Please welcome Professor Pfeiffer.
Before I start, I would like to say that my heart goes out to the victims of Christchurch, victims to an ignoramus of the 21st century, who was certainly not reached by the circulation of knowledge. Thank you very much for this kind introduction, and thank you very much above all for the very kind invitation in the first place. Doha is a place that has a great attraction to anyone studying the late medieval and early modern history, not only of the Arab world, but also of Iran, India, and the Ottoman Empire, due in particular to the riches in manuscript collections it holds today in its museums and libraries, which I already had the chance to use over the past years, and I'm very happy to be back. I'm delighted to speak here among esteemed colleagues and friends, and particularly pleased to be here during a two-day conference, which will, I'm sure, provide ample opportunities to deepen and expand the modern network of scholars whose interests coalesce during this conference, but also more generally, on the theme of transformation and continuities in Islamic intellectual thought. And here we are already right in medias res. By framing or by focusing on the 16th to 18th centuries, I do perceive a an echo myself. It's a bit weird. By focusing on the 16th to 18th centuries, this conference assumes that the period in question, with and without transformations, was in and by itself a block that has shared distinctive features that distinguish it from what went before. In this lecture, I shall therefore put the spotlight on the late 15th and beginning of the 16th century, presumably a turning point, and the beginning of this period, and test this assumption based on one very specific case, starting from the large private library of the Ottoman scholar Mu'ayyadzadeh, who traveled and studied extensively in early modern Anatolia, Mamluk Aleppo, and Aqoyunlu Fars. This keynote tests the fault lines of the circulation of knowledge against political breaks in history, arguing that while the transformations in intellectual thought are on the surface independent of and impermeable against political change, the circulation of knowledge is highly dependent on various concrete contexts and institutions in which the scholars negotiating this knowledge move. Politics, economics, and social status and social mobility do matter and had a transformative impact on what was read and what was not. In other words, intellectual thought and the reception history of so many works depended heavily on those contexts. They are not intrinsic to the subject matter, but are in the end an epistemological question and each individual scholar's methodological choice. In this lecture, I would like to emphasize the role of seemingly minor figures who were nonetheless essential in shaping early modern Islamicate intellectual life by crisscrossing dynastic and regional boundaries, and who thereby contributed to a certain coherence of not only the cultural landscape of Southeast Anatolia, but indeed Iran and Central Asia as well. Here I will use the lens of networks of scholars and their literary output as the glue and trajectory that contributed to this coherence. One such case in point is the Ottoman scholar, Qadi, and bibliophile Abdurrahman bin Ali bin Muayyad, who died in 922 or 1516, and I will continue with CE dates from here on, known as Mu'ayyadzadeh, and his personal library. And I'm very happy to see that actually the cover of our program is a library, and we have been invited to visit the bookshop as well. I've recently published his teacher Dawani's Ijaza to Mu'ayyadzadeh, and I'm now preparing for publication the inventory of his personal library that was drawn after his death on behalf of the Ottoman Sultan Selim. Based on this early 16th century library inventory, as well as the marginal notes in some of the books that Mu'ayyadzadeh once owned or read, this paper investigates Mu'ayyadzadeh's antiquarian interests in the context of the intellectual networks of the time and argues that this Ottoman intellectual's interests were nourished by his lifelong interaction with the intellectual circles in Shiraz and Herat, adding these regions to the cultural landscape of Anatolia and placing the latter into a wider context. I've worked on the Mongols for quite a while, so I'm used to thinking in a Eurasian context, but you will see soon that we will zoom in very closely to the life and works of Mu'ayyadzadeh, down to the tiniest and most detailed ownership marks. A contemporary to the King of Hungary and Croatia, Matthias Corvinus, who died in 1490, whose legendary Renaissance library has mesmerized generations, and there's even a novel about it, the Ottoman scholar, Qadi, and bibliophile Abdurrahman bin Ali bin Muayyad, known as Mu'ayyadzadeh, was famed for his Neoplatonic learning and splendid book collection. According to the Ottoman polymath Tashkupuzadeh, who died in 1561 and whose father knew Mu'ayyadzadeh personally, quote, Mu'ayyadzadeh had gathered all kinds of extraordinary books, among them books of which none of the contemporaries had knowledge by virtue of actually reading them. I heard that these are 7,000 volumes, excluding doublets. End of quote. This exceeds by far the number of books in the Bibliotheca Corviniana, which even by generous estimates is said to have held some 4,000 to 5,000 works in up to 2,500 codices, of which merely 221 volumes survive, or the humble 1488 precursor of Oxford's famous Bodleian Library, known as Duke Humphreys, which prides itself in a priceless collection of more than 281 manuscripts. Of course, the 7,000 of Tashkubuzadeh may be to a certain extent exaggerated, but certainly, as we shall see, there was more to Mu'ayyadzadeh. The building of the famous Bodleian Library in Oxford itself was not begun until a century later, in 1598, and was furbished to hold then no more than 2,500 volumes, of which some were donated by the founder and namesake, Thomas Bodley himself, who died in 1613. While high, even in comparison to some of the foremost Renaissance libraries of Europe, the number given by Tashkubuzadeh does not appear quite as fantastic when considered in the Ottoman context. As Renaissance libraries were mushrooming across 15th century Europe, so they were in the Ottoman Empire. Here, as throughout Islamic history, learning and knowledge were highly prized by scholars and jewelers alike. Books and libraries were an intrinsic part of intellectual life, as evidenced by the massive manuscript production and the historical references to the existence not only of madrasa and royal libraries, but also to private libraries such as Mu'ayyadzadeh's. What is special about the Ottoman context, in comparison to earlier Islamic libraries, is the sheer amount and quality of the sources available on book culture, including endowment records, donation lists, and library catalogues, such as the inventories discussed here, that become increasingly available from the 15th century onwards as part of a concerted effort at the systematization of knowledge in an ever-expanding and interconnected world. We are fortunate that a copy of the inventory of Mu'ayyadzadeh's library, as drafted on behalf of the Ottoman Sultan Selim, who reigned from 1512 to 1520, soon after Mu'ayyadzadeh's death in 1516, has survived. This inventory records 2,112 titles. We remember that the libraries of Corvinus and Huntington were in the 200s. This is 10 times as much, even after parts of it had been sold, as we shall see. The actual number of books that were part of Mu'ayyadzadeh's collection was probably somewhere between this figure and the number claimed by Tashkubuzadeh, 7,000, as some of his books were sold before the inventory was drafted. While the list in our hands thus represents only a partial record of the original library, it is still a bright reflection of the impressive erudition of the owner and collector. So this is an insight into my current chantier. What is more, the inventory of Mu'ayyadzadeh's library is both contemporary and comparative in size to the catalogue of the holdings of the Ottoman Palace Library in Istanbul, prepared on behalf of Bayezid II in the years 1502 to 1504. The latter shows some 7,200 titles in about 5,700 volumes and therefore offers itself for comparison. As for the contents of Mu'ayyadzadeh's library, we can tell from the remaining books that it had a universal outlook. Educated in the erudite circles of Ottoman Amasya, Mamluk Aleppo, and Aqyunluk Shiraz, Mu'ayyadzadeh had enjoyed a broad education, and his library reflects it. The sciences represented range from the Quranic sciences and exegesis, theology, mysticism, philosophy, jurisprudence, and legal rulings, to grammar, philology, prosody, rhetorics, penmanship and calligraphy, historiography, biography, genealogy and geography, the sciences of the stars, astronomy and astrology, geometry, mathematics, optics, mineralogy, alchemy, geomancy, dreams and divination, talismans, magic squares and incantation, music and the belles lettres, all the way to pharmacopoeias and medicine, including veterinary medicine and works on falconry. In the breadth of sciences covered, Mu'ayyadzadeh's library did not need to fear comparison with Bayezid's, nor any of the European libraries established in the Renaissance spirit. It was the focus and comparison of each library, composition of each library that distinguished them, though overall they are surprisingly similar, given that one was a private and the other a royal library. For example, and like Bayezid's library, Mu'ayyadzadeh's held a comparatively high proportion of works in the sciences of the stars, medicine and the occult, reflecting the great interest of the age in these areas of inquiry, both in the Ottoman Empire and beyond, including Renaissance Europe. In terms of numbers, however, a much larger space than either astronomy or medicine is occupied in both inventories by literature. More than 60 pages in the inventory of Bayazid, if we count literature in all languages together, as well as Sufism, hagiography, and ethics, more than 40 pages in Bayazid's inventory. The proportions are similar in Mu'ayyad-Zadeh's collection. For the purpose of this lecture, Divan literature was selected for a comparative case study. But let us first turn to the bibliophile owners of these collections, namely Bayazid II and Mu'ayyad-Zadeh. Mu'ayyad-Zadeh was not only Bayazid's close contemporary, Bayazid was by 8 years his elder and predeceased Mu'ayyad-Zadeh by 4 years. They also grew up together in Amasya, where Mu'ayyad-Zadeh's father, Shamsuddin Mu'ayyad Chalabi, was appointed Chancellor, Nishanje, to Prince Bayazid upon the latter's appointment as governor in 1461. In Amasya, they enjoyed an outstanding education also in the fine arts, studying the art of writing with one of the foremost calligraphers of the time, the Amasya-born Sheikh Hamdullah, who died in 1520, and moved among the circles of some of the finest poets of that age, including the poetess Mihri, who died after 1512, who is known to have developed a liking for Mu'ayyad-Zadeh in her youth. It was in Amasya that Prince Bayazid and Mu'ayyad-Zadeh forged a relationship that was to last throughout their lives. And here comes in the importance of patronage, though we should not focus on that. Their boon companionship in the 1470s in Amasya apparently acquired dimensions that displeased Bayazid's father, Mehmed II, the conqueror of Istanbul, to the extent that he issued an order for Mu'ayyad-Zadeh's removal. After escaping from Amasya, first to Aleppo and then Shiraz, where he studied for several years with Jalaluddin Dawani, who died in 1502, and I showed you just the ijaza that Dawani issued to Mu'ayyad-Zadeh. Mu'ayyad-Zadeh was called back to the Ottoman Empire after Mehmed II's death to serve Bayazid after his accession to the Ottoman throne in 1481. Just to show a little bit, Shiraz was really a center an important center and turning point in Mu'ayyad-Zadeh's life. He did have connections clearly to Herat as well as to Bukhara. These were areas that are strongly represented in his library. He did, however, return via Amasya to Edirne and Istanbul, Constantinople, did maintain his connections strongly to Shiraz throughout this time, and also acquired and procured books, apparently, from the East. Mu'ayyad-Zadeh held high offices, now back in the Ottoman Empire, including that of chief military judge, Kazasker, throughout Bayezid II's and the first half of his son and successor Selim's reigns until shortly before his death in 1516. Bayezid and Mu'ayyad-Zadeh apparently also shared the taste for rare and valuable books. Mu'ayyad-Zadeh's upbringing in a learned family with extended studies in Shiraz, the connections he forged with the scholars there, and the books he brought with him or that were sent to him afterwards as gifts, played a key part in the circulation of knowledge between the late 15th century Ottoman Empire and Aqoyunlu Fars. However, as recent research has also shown, the scholarly networks established over the preceding 2 centuries were equally important in this, as they clearly informed the shape and scope of Mu'ayyad-Zadeh's and actually also Bayezid's libraries. Mu'ayyad-Zadeh apparently collected and, where he could not own them, borrowed books both for their contents and because of the intrinsic value of specific copies. Some of the actual copies with Mu'ayyad-Zadeh's owners or copying marks had been made from autograph copies that were also carefully collated with the autograph or other authoritative copies. For instance, Mu'ayyad-Zadeh once owned a copy made directly from an autograph copy, Nuskhatul Mu'allif, of Qutbuddin Shirazi's Sharh Hikmatul Ishraq, which had also been collated twice with the original and was then collated a third time by Al-Hassan bin Ali al-Mutatabib al-Mawlawi al-Siwasi, quote, from a copy of the text which had been read with the author, Nusra Maqru'a ala al-Musannif. On folio 1a, this copy bears an owner's note by Abdurrahman bin Ali bin Muayyad, dated Friday, the 7th of Ramadan, 901, that's the 20th of May, 1496, in Istanbul, Bimahrusa Constantinia. Other books that Muayyadzadeh bought or borrowed were also previously owned and or annotated by key figures in the production and circulation of knowledge, such as Zainul Arab al-Misri, who completed his commentary on Avicenna's Qanun in 1350, or were previously owned by otherwise famous scholars, including authors of non-Muslim background, such as the Syriac Mafrian Bar Hebreus, who died in 1286. For instance, a copy of Nasiruddin Tusi's comments on Archimedes' treatise on sphere and cylinder, Kitab Archimedes fi Kura wal Iswana, bears both an ownership mark of Muayyadzadeh, dated to Rabiul Awal 914, starting in July 1508, and the record in Syriac ex libris of Gregory the Lowly Mafrian, year 1592 of the Greeks, year 1280-81, which means it dates to the lifetime of Bar Hebreus. In other words, Muayyadzadeh was well aware of the genealogy of learning that these specific copies embodied, and he consciously collected and consulted them primarily for this reason. Yet there were also books in his library that Muayyadzadeh personally commissioned to be copied on his behalf. These were thus fresh copies of works that were apparently not or only rarely found in Ottoman circles, or which he simply wanted to own. But even here, he carefully selected as the master copy such manuscripts that had been prepared by specialists in the field, and took care to collate the new copy once again with the master copy. For instance, Muayyadzadeh left the following note on a copy of Nasiruddin Tusi's Tahrir Uqlidis fi Usul al-Handasa wal Hisab, quote, I had this copy made from a copy prepared by the hand of the distinguished and most erudite master known as Nizam al-Araj. I, Abdurrahman bin Ali bin Muayyad al-Rumi al-Amasi, who am in need of the one God's kindness, collated it with it according to my ability as much as possible. استكتبت هذه النسخة من نسخة بخط المولى الفاضل العلامة المشتهر بالنظام العارج وقابلتها بها حسب الوسط والإمكان وأنا الفقير إلى رحمة الرب الأحد عبد الرحمن بن علي بن المؤيد الرومي الأماسي. He dated this event to Tuesday, the 18th of Ramadan, 885, the 21st of November, 1480, in Shiraz, Bimadinat Shiraz. So here we have a further point of evidence that he was there during this time. And Nizam al-Araj almost certainly refers to Nizamuddin bin Hassan bin Muhammad bin Hussein al-Araj an-Nishapuri, who died in 1330, who authored an important commentary on Tusi's Tazkira. In other words, the copy that Muayyadzadeh selected as a basis for his fresh copy had been prepared by a scholar who knew what he was doing when he wrote out the text, and equally important in this particular case, his name stood for the accurate execution of the highly intricate geometrical illustrations accompanying the text. So these are quite something. On Nizam al-Nishapuri, Robert Morrison has published a wonderful monograph titled Islam and Science, the Intellectual Career of Nizamuddin al-Nishapuri. So we, thanks to him, also know more about him. As for the doublets in Muayyadzadeh's library here, in-depth studies of individual cases will be necessary to scrutinize why Muayyadzadeh may have wished to consult more than one copy of the same work. The evidence for now suggests that he was a scholar with broad interests and a high epistemological consciousness who was not satisfied with references of a lesser order, later copies, when he could have access to autograph copies or copies annotated by famous scholars or past specialists in the field. In other words, where modern scholars read journal articles, pre-modern authors like Mu'ayyadzadeh would have consulted the margins of manuscripts that embodied the collective knowledge of the field through the comments and analysis of past scholars. The topic was defined by the main text of a given work, and the analysis and scholarship about it in modern jargon, the secondary literature, was delivered right with it in the margins together with its epistemological framework. Not a bad way to carry out research. Probably because of his precarious financial situation, Mu'ayyadzadeh never established an endowment for his library. His books were sold and dispersed upon his death and are now found in various libraries across the world, which makes it a particularly daunting task to establish a list of his surviving books. It is difficult to reconstruct the sequence of events after his death, but the available evidence supports, at least partially, the following scenario. The late Mu'ayyadzadeh's sons, and he had 4 of them who survived him, possibly 5, sold a part of his library in order to pay his debts. The funds that they raised from the sale appear to have covered his debts only partially. At this point, the Ottoman Sultan Selim became aware of the dispersal of Mu'ayyadzadeh's collection. Now the son of Bayezid is taking care of him. He dispatched a delegation to gather Mu'ayyadzadeh's books, if necessary, from the booksellers. Selim instructed his delegates to record the books that they were able to recuperate, resulting in the book inventory that I'm studying and editing, and then sell them on his behalf so that the deceased Mu'ayyadzadeh would be relieved of his debts. As suggested by Ismail Erunsal, it is reasonable to think that Selim also wanted the books themselves, possibly in order to fill lacuna in his palace library. The inventory includes the instructions made to Selim's delegation. Quote, however many books had belonged to the late Mu'ayyadzadeh, they should be collected, and if they have already been sold, they should be bought back from the places to which they have been sold and be safely stored in a place. End of quote. Selim's order also contains a clause indicating that he asked for important muhim books to be singled out and highlighted as such, which reinforces the impression that one of the purposes was to acquire some of these for the palace library. Quote, the number of Mu'ayyadzadeh's creditors is endless. If the important manuscripts were pointed out to the emperor and the remainder sold and the proceeds given to the creditors, the deceased Mu'ayyadzadeh would be relieved from his debts and could rest in peace. End of quote. And we come back in the end to the economic side of things. Probably as a result of these instructions, Mu'ayyadzadeh's books were recorded in 2 distinct lists, with most of the most valuable manuscripts, apparently the important books, recorded in the first list and often marked as first-rate copies, ala, next to each item. Under the bottom line, what this means for us end users several centuries later is that these lists are not ordered alphabetically or by topic, but simply by value and apparently in the order in which they were retrieved. And the actual copies are therefore now all over the world. Thus, if one wanted to find all copies of a given book or title in a given discipline in Mu'ayyadzadeh's inventory, one would first need to go systematically through the entirety of Mu'ayyadzadeh's inventory and establish alphabetical indices of all books and authors contained in them, and then identify them. This I've done, and I'm currently preparing for publication, with at this point about 10% of the books remaining that have yet to be read and identified. Titles, not the books. The second step was to select a meaningful subgroup for investigation and possible comparison with the inventory of his former boon companion and patron Bayezid. For this task, a clearly defined and comparable selection had to be made. Here, Divan literature offered itself as one of the fields with the sharpest contours, as a combination of the generic title Divan with the author's name promised to yield the most reliable identification for a confined yet sizable group of texts that were also of importance to Mu'ayyadzadeh. If you just have the title Mulakhas, it could be any book. Divans also offer themselves for meaningful comparison, not only because both Mu'ayyadzadeh and Bayezid were collectors of poetry, but they also both wrote poetry and were patrons of poets. Mu'ayyad composed poetry in all three languages, Arabic, Persian, and Turkish, under the pen name Khatimi. Among the poets who benefited from Mu'ayyad patronage were Nejati, who died in 1509, Kemal Pashazadeh, 1534, and Zati, who died in 1546. Hence, we may assume that he was somewhat a connoisseur when it came to collecting poetry. For the purpose of this lecture, and without skirting the important question of the authorship of divans, the divan of author X shall be treated as the divan of author X, regardless whether the poetry gathered in it was composed by or later ascribed to the author, and regardless of whether the divan was gathered by the author himself or herself or put together by third parties after their death. Known titles, for instance, the Sirtul Zand for the Divan of Ma'ari, the Hamasa for Abu Tammam, and the Iraqiyat and Najdiyat for the two parts of the Divan of Abu Muzaffar al-Abibardi, were checked against the alphabetical work index of Mu'ayyad Zadeh's inventory to ensure that no divans were omitted. For the present study, the entirety of Mu'ayyad Zadeh's inventory was used for the reasons mentioned, whereas for Bayezid's inventory, only the Dawawin sections in Arabic, Persian, and Ottoman and Chagatai Turkish were systematically read and analyzed. Lastly, while this lecture concentrates to a large part on books and libraries, we must not forget that it was above all people who drove the debates, nurtured the culture of learning, and penned and reproduced the very books that permit us to catch a glimpse of the past. Scholarly gatherings in and outside of mosques, madrasas, in majlises of learning and poetry alike, including, one would imagine, gatherings convened in private homes in the vicinity of private libraries, were the spaces where debates were carried out, poetry proclaimed, and further knowledge produced, without which even the best library would be but shelves filled with empty paper. Mu'ayyad Zadeh's personal library comprised a substantial number of divans by major poets, often in several copies. Thus, we learn that he owned at least 4 copies of Mutanabbi's divan alone, together with 3 different commentaries, shars, of the same work, as well as possibly a 5th divan or parts thereof listed as Ash'ar Mutanabbi. It is unfortunate that the inventory of Mu'ayyad Zadeh's books is only a partial record of his total library, but even this glimpse is impressive. On the other hand, the comparison with the Palace Library makes Mu'ayyad Zadeh's book collection look much more modest than Tashkupri Zadeh's statement suggests, both in terms of divans held and in terms of the number of copies of each divan that is contained in it. Doublets, as we will recall, Tashkupri Zadeh had already. Out the echo. There it is back. The evidence suggests that the great majority of the cases, in the great majority of the cases, Bayezid's inventory was richer in terms of the number of copies it held of each divan. Where Mu'ayyad Zadeh's inventory shows multiple copies, there does Bayezid's, with the exception of Abu Tammam's divan, where the two collections draw even. In the majority of the cases, the Palace Library held more, often many more, copies than Mu'ayyad Zadeh's library, at least in the form in which it was retrieved after his death. Mu'ayyad Zadeh's private collection stood up well in the face of a comparison with the Palace Library, but in those cases where his private collection held multiple copies, it had also nothing additional to offer in terms of the works held. Whether the individual copies in question offered special features, the fame of former owners and their comments, autograph copies and the like, only an investigation of surviving copies can ultimately answer. Turning to divans identified as outstanding or expensive, Tashkupri Zadeh's comments and the introduction to Bayezid's Palace Library inventory suggests that not only the age and execution, but also the rarity of a book, Qillat Wujud, may have played a role in assessing the value of Mu'ayyad Zadeh's collection. There's only one divan of which the Palace Library did apparently not hold a copy, which is that of a certain Hatifi. The individual in question here is probably the poet and nephew of Jami, Abdullah Hatifi of Kharjiyat in Khorasan, who died in 1521, who belonged to the circle of Herat formed under the liberal patronage of the later Timurids. He appears to have been relatively little known in Ottoman circles at the beginning of the 16th century, and his divan apparently also had not entered the palace library by this time. Here then, Muayyad is a little bit ahead of his time due to his connections, I suspect. Bayezid's inventory only records 2 copies of Hatif's Khosrow Shirin, which is part of Hatif's Khamsa, but no copy of his divan. In addition to Hatif's divan, Muayyad's collection also held an especially precious copy of the entire Khamsa that was apparently also illustrated. Khamsa-i Hatifi, Musawwar Ala. Here Muayyad's travels and protected studies in Shiraz may have led to personal contacts that facilitated the acquisition of this divan and Khamsa. In this particular case, it appears that not only the rarity of the work, but also the execution of the copy in question made the volume particularly valuable. Several of the remaining poets in this first list, such as Hassan, Qasem, Amir Shahi, also belonged to the Herat circle and were possibly less well known among Ottoman readers, though copies were available in the palace library. Here the fame and a certain curiosity for, if not possibly sense of competition with, the sparkling circle of poets around Ali Shir Nawa'i, who died in 1501, at the contemporaneous court of Sultan Hussein Baiqara, who died in 1506 and was a poet himself in Herat, which at some point in the decade between 1490 and 1500 included some 150 to 200 poets, as established by Maria Subtelny, may have contributed to the novelty factor and desirability of these works in Ottoman circles. Equally striking is that 9 of the 10 shared titles of divans that are singled out as particularly valuable in Muayyadzadeh's list number 1, only one, the divan ascribed to Ali bin Abi Talib, was presumably written in Arabic, and there is at the most one Ottoman Turkish divan among the important works of Muayyadzadeh's list 1. The Divan Khayali, though even this is doubtful. Given the period under consideration, it is likely that this refers to Khayali Bukhari, who died in 1446, author of a Persian divan, rather than the more famous but much later Ottoman poet Khayali, who died in 1557. In sum, we can state that divans in Persian constituted the overwhelming majority of the key divans recorded in Muayyadzadeh's list 1. As Ismail Erinsaleh pointed out, during this period, Ottoman readers continued to hold Persian literature in high esteem, and Persian poets were regarded as models. Hence, it is not particularly surprising to find such a high number of Persian divans among Muayyadzadeh's books. A similar image emerges from an investigation of both Muayyadzadeh's lists 1 and 2 taken together. 2 are all the doublets and the less beautiful and less important copies. Only one of the authors, Eshki or Ashki, who flourished during the period of Mehmed II, wrote in Ottoman. And at the most 2, Bana'i, who died in 1512, and Lotfi, who possibly died in 1492, wrote in Chagatai Turkish. However, at least part of their divans as well was probably in Persian, as no divan entirely written in Chagatai Turkish is known to have been authored by Bana'i, who is, by contrast, known to have authored 2 divans in Persian and even actively opposed Turkish as a literary language in his early life. He's famous for that. Overall, Muayyadzadeh's literary orientation was clearly in the Persianate East. This should not be surprising, given his extended sojourn and study with the foremost scholars of Shiraz in the 1470s and 1480s, with whom he apparently maintained close relations after also returning to the Ottoman Empire and Ottoman service. In a sense, this shows that Muayyadzadeh's library was both built selectively and is a reflection of his very specific vita and historical context. If Muayyadzadeh's library did once hold Ottoman divans, which were perhaps sold too swiftly after his death to be recorded in the inventory, we do not know. Clear is that Muayyadzadeh's collection did hold a significant number of Persian divans. This is paralleled by a significant number of Persian divans in Bayezid's collection. In both inventories, Turkish as a literary language is present, but it is smaller than the Persian and Arabic sections, at least in terms of absolute numbers, which confirms our knowledge of the history of Ottoman Turkish as a literary language. The remaining divans of Mu'ayyad-Zadeh's library are recorded in the second inventory list. In addition to the already discussed divans represented with multiple copies, Mu'ayyad-Zadeh's list includes single copies of the divan of Anbari, Ibn Arabi, Bakharzi, Bana'i, Humam, Ibn Farid, Ibn Ishaq, Ibn al-Khatib al-Maghribi, Ibn Qari, Ibn Bata, Iraqi, Eshqi, Khawari, Kamal Khujandi, Lotfi, Shirin Maghribi, Qadi Isa, Qutb, there are several candidates, Ruknuddin, Saad, Shahid, Sheikh Attar, Sheikh Yahya Sarsari, Sharaf Rami, Sultan Ahmad, Sultan al-Arifin, again we have several contenders here, the Divan of Ubayd Zakani and the Divan of a certain Zahir or Zuhair, as well as several divans of which I have so far not been able to identify the authors. And if anybody here can tell me who, perhaps somebody called Ridai, Sarume, Yazd or Najd, I have a guess here, but I'm not sure. And Radi is, I'd be very happy to hear about that. Of the majority of these divans, the Palace Library also held copies. In general terms, Mu'ayyad-Zadeh's library inventory largely overlaps with and generally confirms the literary canon represented by the Palace Library, albeit on a smaller scale, and with an overall stronger collection of divans, especially in Persian as well as, to a lesser extent, in Arabic. Though key poets writing in Arabic are also present together with ash'ars, very interesting phenomenon, as we have already seen. Major poets are well represented, also with literary works other than divans, especially when they wrote in Persian. Nizami's Khamse, Attar's Musibat-Name, Rumi's Masnavi, Sa'di's Kulliyat, and the Golestan, and Jami's Khamsa are all recorded in Mu'ayyad-Zadeh's inventory. And remember, this is only the inventory of the books that were collected after his death and after many had already been sold. And we do find them today elsewhere than in Istanbul. Equally well represented are lesser, or at least today lesser known poets such as Hatefi, Esmat, and Bisati, who are all recorded in list 1. By contrast, Mu'ayyad-Zadeh's inventory is overall, in comparison to Bayezid's, significantly weaker on the Turkish side. This is particularly visible in the area of Chagatai works, which at that point were flourishing in one of the politically most stable centers of the cultural efflorescence in the Eastern Islamic lands under the patronage of Sultan Hussein Balqara and Mir Ali Shir Nawawi in Herat. Not surprisingly, given its royal patronage and larger size, the Palace Library inventory features a large number of books that are not found in Mu'ayyad-Zadeh's inventory, including books that one would normally expect to find in it, such as copies of the divans of Mu'ayyad-Zadeh's own protégés. The absence of Za'ati's divan in Mu'ayyad-Zadeh's inventory is not further surprising, given his late death date in 1546. And the presence of the divan of a poet of this name in Bayezid's catalogue probably denotes another poet with the same Makhlas, Za'ati, who lived during an earlier period. By contrast, the absence of Nejati's divan in Mu'ayyad-Zadeh's catalogue is surprising, as Nejati not only predeceased Mu'ayyad-Zadeh, but was encouraged by him to collect his dispersed ghazals in a divan, which he did, and he subsequently dedicated it to Mu'ayyad-Zadeh, a dedication that itself created a major splash in Ottoman circles as it went against etiquette and stepped over some more senior individuals. This is thus most probably one of those works that had already been sold before Selim was able to retrieve the remainder and draw up those lists. Returning to Tashkrupizade's quote at the beginning of this lecture, one of the aims here had been to assess whether Mu'ayyad-Zadeh had indeed been in the possession of books that were otherwise not known in Ottoman lands. The other aim was to find out in which ways these books were special and what this can tell us about the literary canon of the time. So we turn to the Harawi and Bukharan literary circles now. There are two major differences between the two inventories in the area of Divan literature. As noted above, one is the greater presence of divans in Ottoman and Chagatai Turkish in Bayezid's library, judging by Mu'ayyad-Zadeh's incomplete inventory. Despite its slightly later date, Muayyazade's catalogue is virtually exempt of divans in Ottoman Turkish, except possibly for eşkis or aşkis. Even though most of Muayyazade's own surviving poetry is in Ottoman Turkish. The latter, however, may be more a reflection of a selective survival process dictated by the tastes of the audiences of subsequent centuries rather than the languages in which Muayyadzadeh actually composed. Muayyazade's inventory also holds one, at the most two, divans with verses in Chagatai Turkish. These are a copy of the Divan Lutfi, which, given the dates involved, probably refers to the Divan of the Herat-based Lutfi, who died in 1492, possibly, and who wrote in Chagatai Turkish, and a copy of a Divan of the Herat-born and Herat-educated Banai, who died in 1512, that may have contained some verses in Chagatai. While Banai spent most of his life in Transoxania, he also spent extended periods between Iraq and Tabriz around the time of Muayyadzadeh's sojourn in Shiraz, which was probably when Muayyadzadeh made the acquaintance of his poetry. Bayezid's catalogue, by contrast, records several copies of the divans of the better-known poets writing in Chagatai Turkish, such as Seyfe Sarayi, who died after 1394, who also wrote in Kipchak Turkish, Gadai, who died or flourished in 1492, and of course Mir Alishir Navai, who died in 1501. As already pointed out by Ismail Erimsal, who has investigated the entirety of the section of Turkish literature in Bayezid's inventory, this inventory features a substantial amount of literature in Chagatai Turkish for the period. This would, among others, suggest a rather earlier spread of Navai's works in Ottoman circles than previously assumed. The overall, nonetheless, comparatively low number of divans in Chagatai Turkish in both Bayezid's and especially Muayyadzadeh's catalogues reflects the actual situation, as 90% of the poetry in Central Asia before Alishir Navai were composed in Persian and only 10% in Chagatai Turkish, which somewhat parallels the situation in Ottoman lands. Neither Bayezid's nor Muayyadzadeh's book inventory records copies of Chagatai divans from the first half of the 15th century, such as the divans of Sakaki of Samarkand, who died in 1410, Atai of Balkh, flourished in 1450, and Yusuf Amili of Badakhshan, who flourished in 1433. This would suggest that in the case of Bayezid's inventory, the collection was not so much about the Turkish language in which these divans were written, rather than about the fame, especially of the Haravi circle, in which the later works were produced. Considering that the literary production, especially in the Herat of Hussein Bai Qara, was at its height at exactly this time, and taking into account the debates about the history of Navai's reception in Ottoman literary circles, this shows how much the Palace Library was at the cutting edge of the literary trends of the time. Among the three great centers of Chagatai and Persian literary activity of the 15th century, that is Samarkand, Shiraz, and Herat, Muayyadzadeh's library appears to have been particularly well stocked with poetry and any kind of literature in general of authors who were related to Shiraz and Herat. To these can be added the lesser-known literary circle in Bukhara surrounding Ismatullah Bukhari, who died in around 1437. The connection to Shiraz was obviously established and reinforced through Muayyadzadeh's extended sojourn and study there, so though the connection to Shiraz is much broader, Lale Uluç has established that 60% of the illustrated manuscripts that are held today in the Topkapı Saray Palace of the 16th century were produced in Shiraz. Not in Istanbul, not in Isfahan, not in Tabriz, not in Cairo. 60% of the 16th century illustrated manuscripts in the Topkapı Saray Palace stemmed from Shiraz. So Muayyadzadeh is not alone here. The connection to Herat can be seen particularly well in a cluster of divans from the circle of Hussein Bai Qara that Muayyadzadeh once owned. Hussein Bai Qara is known to have completed his own divan in 1491. While no copy of this divan is listed in Mu'ayyad inventory, it includes copies of the divans of the already mentioned Herat-based poets Lotfi, Jami, and Bana'i. To this group may furthermore be counted Sheikh Shah Hassan Harawi, who is said to have died at the age of 105 in the year 1499. We can further add to this the works of earlier authors from Herat, such as the Divan of Qasim Anbar, who died in 1444, who spent a substantial amount of time in Timurid Herat. Of his Divan, 2 copies are found in the important section of Mu'ayyad-Zadeh's book inventory. Mu'ayyad-Zadeh furthermore owned a copy of the Divan of the poet Amir Shahi of Sabzawar, who died in 1453, who spent some time in Herat in the circle of Baysonghur. And last but not least, Mu'ayyad-Zadeh's catalogue lists a copy of the Divan of the already mentioned maternal nephew of Jami, Hatifi, who was like Qasim al-Anwar from Khargit, not far from Herat, where he served as the custodian of Qasim al-Anwar's tomb that had been built by Mir Ali Shir Nawai. That Nawai's Turkish poetry in particular was avidly read, copied, and even adapted to the Oghuz Turkish dialect prevalent in Akkuyun Shiraz of the early 1470s is evident from the copy of his so-called Divan of the Akkuyunlu admirers that was penned and possibly compiled by the famous Akkuyunlu calligrapher Abdurrahman Kharazmi in 1471. Akkuyunlu Shiraz, which had strong cultural ties with Herat as well as Bukhara, was a key entrepot for the introduction of Nawai's works to Ottoman audiences. Not coincidentally, it is here that Mu'ayyad-Zadeh spent several years of intensive study in the decade immediately following the copying of this divan, and it's not unlikely that Mu'ayyad-Zadeh not only brought with him copies of Nawai's works, but also reinforced the excitement about his poetry in Ottoman circles. However, among his own books, if he owned a copy of Nawai's Divan, it appears to have been sold swiftly, as no copy is recorded in his inventory. Even though Herat, at the turn of the 16th century, was the leading center of literary activities before Shiraz, Cairo, or Istanbul, and a certain interest in such works would thus not be surprising, the above clusters are striking. This seems to point to a personal connection that was perhaps established during Mu'ayyad-Zadeh's studies in Shiraz, so further research will be needed to verify this. Okay. To sum up, while Bayezid's collection was clearly broader and individual works were represented with more copies in comparison to Mu'ayyad-Zadeh's, both libraries represent the wide spectrum of the intellectual interests of their patrons, which overlapped significantly regardless of the fact that one was a dynastic royal library and the other a personal one. While this may not be particularly surprising given the two patrons' shared upbringing and lifelong interaction, it is worth pointing it out, as not always do the interests of scholars and politicians show such strong parallels. One of the reasons for this similarity may be as simple as it is obvious. Both Bayezid and Mu'ayyad-Zadeh did not only love books, they also had vast aspirations and an encyclopedic vision of the ideal library. The ideal library should be as broad and complete as possible, regardless whether this exceeded one's immediate professional needs. Mu'ayyad-Zadeh was a Qadi after all. This points not only to the often quoted thirst for knowledge and encyclopedic approach to learning among the scholars of this period, but indeed to a certain outreach mentality of the book collector that reckons with a broader usership and purpose of his library than consulting it just for his own personal delectation. Potential indications for the public use of Bayezid's library are inconclusive. To which extent this was the case for Mu'ayyad-Zadeh's collection and whether social gatherings and debates may have been carried out there is at this point an open question. As for the divan literature they collected and the role of Ottoman Turkish divans in it, both inventories confirm that at the turn of the 16th century, the Ottoman divan production and reception appears to have been less intensive than only half a century later. As H.F. Hoffman put it, who wrote from the vantage point of Chagatai Turkish literary production during approximately the same period, At the beginning of the 16th century, quote, "The Ottoman muse fluttered, but it purely winged." By the time it started to fly in the mid-16th century, the political and literary landscapes had significantly changed, of which several major Ottoman tezkere works appearing from the mid-16th century onwards in tight succession bear vivid testimony. And we are from the inventory of Mu'ayyad and Bayezid having a look forward rather than the retrospective know-all book look that assumes an earlier production. Bayezid's and Mu'ayyad's book inventories are eloquent correctives to this later literary canon, offering us an insight into the literary tastes at the very beginning of the 16th century that was strongly oriented eastwards, both in terms of contents and in terms of the languages represented. Mu'ayyadzadeh and Bayezid lived at the turning point of the 16th century with such famous literati as Hussein Baqara, Nawa'i, and Jami as their faraway neighbors in Herat, with whose literary achievement they could barely compete, and such bibliophile Renaissance men as Corvinus as a more immediate neighbor in Buda, whose library, even a private library like Mu'ayyadzadeh's, had no difficulty to match. They also lived through a time of major world political changes that had an immediate impact on the Ottoman Empire, including the final blow of the 1492 Reconquista in Spain and the establishment of the Shi'i Safavid dynasty in Iran in 1501, both of which resulted in a major influx of Muslim and non-Muslim refugees to the Ottoman Empire that left deep marks on its cultural, religious, and intellectual history. While the gravity of Mu'ayyadzadeh's own physical whereabouts, as well as that of Bayezid and many of their contemporaries, shifted eventually from Amasya in northern central Anatolia westwards to Istanbul and Edirne, Mu'ayyadzadeh's library was clearly inscribed into an earlier network of scholars that extended well into Fars, Khorasan, and Central Asia. It is perhaps because he was so much connected to past networks and learning, which may have been to the detriment of his engagement with more recent developments, that his own work, like his library, was dispersed. Mu'ayyadzadeh wrote more than 24 works, but they remain unpublished. Mu'ayyadzadeh also gathered a massive private library, but he did not have the means to endow it. So these copies are found all over the world. He wrote and collected poetry and encouraged others, such as Nejati, to gather their poetry in a Divan, but he does not have a Divan to his name. And he wrote extensively in the area of law, but was soon outshone in this area by one of his students, Ebu Suud Effendi. Last but not least, we, today's scholars of intellectual history, may have to add to our banners not only the social history, institutions like madrasas and Sufi tariqas, informal intellectual networks and patronage relationships, and very strongly also at the economic history of the period, lest we overlook an important factor in the production and circulation of knowledge now and then. While Mu'ayyadzadeh may look like someone who was ultimately unsuccessful in his bibliophile endeavors, studying people like him will enable us to study the undercurrents, transition periods, turning points, and impasses in history that are not usually in the spotlight of research, reminding us of a few blind spots in the intellectual landscapes of modern scholarship along the way. Thank you.
First of all, I've introduced myself. I'm an Ottoman historian. I was born in Jerusalem, so I'm supposedly a Palestinian Arab who was trained in Ottoman history, and basically I'm a historian. So I'm looking, and I have to tell you, I'm a little deaf, so I couldn't follow every step of your presentation. But overall, my question in terms of the theme of the conference. What I've seen you doing is, in a way, mechanically show how certain texts moved from one to another. In other words, and all what you shown us is really that, rather than the content of the text. And I thought the important part is to figure out what was being transmitted. In other words, what ideas, what values, and especially as is your aim is to look for something that eventually becomes a commonality. Right? I mean, the whole theme is three cultures introduced. They look different, but somehow, somewhere, actually they participated in the creation of a common culture. So the question for me is, and again, maybe you could define where you are in this process of work. In other words, how do you see your task at this stage in your life in terms of, are you looking for, really looking at how ideas, concepts, values pass from a text, more importantly, a person, a living society, let alone a living society receiving this text and interpreting it for its own purposes, let alone figure out at what stage in its development it had reached to be able to receive these ideas and creatively appropriate them to have new meaning.
Well, I'm probably preaching here to the converted, as some Chicago people in the audience and some other people. Basically, obviously, this period does need to be investigated. Most of the texts remain unpublished. Robert Wisnowski has established that about 85% of the works in philosophy of the what he calls post-classical, so post-Mongol period, remain unpublished. So. Every step we do means we have to engage with manuscripts, and we are much slower than people who have a Loeb library or something. So this is a cutting-edge period now, because people have discovered that we need to make the bridge between early Islam, the beginnings, the formative period, etc., and modern oil pipelines and things like that. In terms of the contents, I can just give a couple of examples that may be telling. One from Muayyad himself, who, as he studied in Shiraz, you will have seen that he was heavily engaged with and interested in geometry, the sciences, mathematics, etc. And in the article that I published on his Ijaza, I actually speak about the works that they read together. So, for instance, he went to Shiraz and he studied the Mulakhas of Jakhmini, which is on the one hand a basic book on astronomy. On the other hand, it shows, well, he did study that. He read Euclid with the Tusi Sharh, etc. So that's something that you can actually read, and I've made an argument that the interests of the people are narrowing ever more. We have polymaths like at some point Avicenna, who is also has a foot in medicine, etc., and it gets ever narrower. So people do specialize to a certain extent. That's certainly some observation that I had there. Through this engagement with geometry, with optics, through studying with Dawani, reading strongly of the works of Giorgiani. He brought things to the Ottoman Empire that I'm not sure that were actually fully picked up, and that has yet to be investigated. His engagement in the area of atomism involves an interpretation of bringing in the aspect of time and motion in ways that are not necessarily seen in earlier works on that. But this means for each of these works that he, for instance, wrote, Muayyad, we don't have an edition. Nobody has, we don't even know how many copies. Well, I've done some survey. So some of his works in law, for instance, I say he was overshown by his own student, by Abu Soud. He has both a systematic work on law, right? He starts with Tahara and it ends with Wasiya and stuff like that. And he quotes heavily from the Munya and the Qunya, and you see how he might be a transmitter of some sort of Sadr Sharia Thani and things like that, right? Maturidism making its way into the Ottoman Empire. But he was not the only trajectory. There's many trajectories. And one thing that I was trying to question, and I'm not sure I put that forth strong enough, but this communality, I wonder whether we ought even to search for it. Is there a communality for the 16th to 18th centuries? I think there's diversity, and I think we have to listen to the individual voices and then try to make sense of it. And we also need to see those what are called impasses in history. So somebody goes in one direction, it doesn't mean that it has to come down to us and explain who we are. At some point this thing ends, but it was there. And it's in communication with this ending thing that what we are today, what we see today, has evolved. And in that we have to look into the context. And somebody like Moayyad-Zadeh, he was for too long outside of the Ottoman Empire to really have established tight-knit networks with all the scholars of his time. Yes, he was well connected, but he was not entirely fully in this madrasa system that then would have given people the incentive to actually read his works. They didn't. They didn't do it to the same extent as they read other people. So that kind of, personal vita, that context, etc., doesn't mean anything if you're connected to the top, if you're cut off from the mid-level. Well, I'm a Hutchisonian. I grew up in Chicago. I took his class as a graduate student. I was a TA, and then I taught it. I can't deny that. But I perhaps overplayed the Persian side of things because he was in Shiraz for 5 to 7 years. So then that's obvious that he stayed there. He did spend about 6 months in Aleppo. He studied Zamakhshari's grammar there. He obviously had started Arabic beforehand. A good Ottoman scholar would know those 3 languages, otherwise they wouldn't, they wouldn't work. And he also has a substantial number of divans in Arabic, looking just at the divans. Plus, much of the other works that I haven't focused on because it's not so easy to identify which work we're talking about. If you have something like the Mufassal or the Mulakhas, which one is it? It could be a work on medicine, or it could be a work on law. If you once you have identified them, and this is question 3, right? Finding the actual copies, then it's okay. But for the divans, I was on safe grounds because we have the author each time together with the divan. That's why I went there for the comparative purposes. So there were lots of Arabic books in his collection. He did study Arabic. In Aleppo, he was told, and we're talking here about still the Mamluk period, right? These areas become Cairo, and these areas become Ottoman only after 1517. So he went into a different area. Actually, he was told by some Tujjar that if he really wanted to learn something, he had to go to Shiraz. That's where things were going on at that point. Sorry to say, that's what his time gave him. Right? He went first to Aleppo to study Arabic, but for the rest of it, apparently he wanted something else, and he did get it somewhere else. Okay, the Republic of Letters. The Republic of Letters that Ibn Bimbash refers to is from a much earlier period, right? We are talking about the 1430s, 50s. So now we've moved beyond that, and we're not in the Timurid lands, we're in the Aquyunu lands. I haven't seen anything about the Ikhwan Safa and the kind of triggering keywords in the things that he's writing. He doesn't seem to be part of this network, but he was certainly somebody who was heavily engaged with a philosophical type of theology. Certainly somebody who was open for those things. Yes. So, the Persianate world, is not what I was particularly focusing. That's what Muayyazade's Vita drew me into. That's that. How does the library compare to Bayazid's library? Well, that's what I did for the Divan section. So Bayazid's is more comprehensive, is larger, of course. It's a royal library, but this library compared well and was at the cutting edge of all the things that were read at the time. I could venture into a theory that I have about how the palace library was furnished and how some of the books entered up in the catalog of Bayazid, but that's not a theory that's liked by the editor, the main editor of that library. I personally think that some of the books of Muayyazade's collection ended up in the palace library, and also. Maybe this phone does work. Anyway, I think that's actually the intention of Selim, right? The intention was to get some of these, the books of Muayyadzadeh, and to make them enter the palace library, and that's what they did, obviously. But many of them also are now found elsewhere in Leiden and Berlin and Yazd and all over the world. Baghdad, Cairo absent. Yes, that's where he didn't go. That's why that was absent. That doesn't mean that there was no intellectual activity going on. I think that many of the Arabic divans he actually acquired in the Levant when he was there, and also later through the connections that he established. As for the actual copies, yes, I have tried to find them. It's like a needle in a haystack. I found about 50, but you have to really. You have to go through a library collection where you suspect there is one, and maybe after 2 weeks of going through hundreds of manuscripts, you find one, and then your hair stand up. When I see that there is something that says, "Ista'arahu min az-zaman al-faqir ila rabbihi as-samad," and then you have this understated, I borrow this book from the pages of time. And it will only be passingly in my hands. That's very nice. And I've also found marginalia of books that do not have his ownership marks, where he does engage with scholars, with other scholars. He says, the Shafi'is say this, but actually I think that is right. And he signs it, right, as Muayyazzadeh. So that's also quite nice. So you see his footsteps of engagement.